Hi, this is Dr. Patrick Cohn with KidSportsPsychology.com. Today I have a short video for you on how athletes become frustrated and the mechanisms underlying frustration in sports. Okay, what you're looking at right now is my model of frustration in athletics and how athletes become frustrated. We can take a look at 4 quadrants: an athlete's disposition and what predisposes the athlete to becoming frustrated, some of the sport triggers that might help trigger the athlete into some negative emotions, and then finally, how do those negative emotions affect the athlete's performance? Let's first take a look at the athlete's disposition or characteristics that might predispose athletes to becoming more frustrated. Well, highly competitive athletes hate to lose, and when they're losing, that obviously can predispose them to becoming frustrated. Athletes with very high expectations, when they don't perform up to those expectations, it's easy to become frustrated. Typically very highly motivated athletes or athletes with a lot of motivation and work hard at their game, they don't like to make mistakes or lose. In the same way, perfectionists who go out there and expect to perform perfectly in the game, they have issues, obviously, with emotional control and dealing with frustration. Athletes that have a need to show off or look for social approval as well, those are the athletes that want to show others that they're better than their mistakes. And sometimes it can be a learned behavior. If athletes have parents or coaches that show a lot of frustration, then it can be a learned behavior on their part of the athlete. What are some of the sport triggers that can lead athletes to become frustrated? Well, obviously, mistakes. Athletes with high expectations and that are perfectionists, they can't deal with the mistakes, and it causes them to become easily frustrated. Generally, when athletes are frustrated, they're blocked from some type of a goal. Mental errors. Many athletes can get upset with mental errors because they think those are things that are preventable. Coaches' criticism or an opponent's behavior. Other people in the sport environment can trigger an emotional reaction, just like an unfair call from an official. So those are some of the sport triggers that might impact whether an athlete is going to become frustrated or not. Now, what happens when an athlete becomes frustrated? Obviously, they have a sense of frustration. There often can be anger within oneself or towards an opponent or an official or a coach. There's resentment, hostility. Often athletes that are in a highly agitated state can stop caring, or eventually they feel helpless. Well, how does all of this, the anger and the frustration, the hostility, how does it affect an athlete's performance? Let's take a look at that next. Many things can happen when an athlete becomes frustrated or upset. They either try harder or tie themselves up in knots because they want to get that error back. They want to get that mistake back. They lost the ball in the basketball game, or the ball was stolen in the soccer game, so they try really hard to get the ball back, for example. Often a pattern we see is they dwell on errors and think over and over how awful that error was. They're ruminating on the past, obviously. Athletes can lose confidence as well because they feel like they're underperforming, not performing up to their expectation. Some athletes want to quit. Like I mentioned earlier, they feel like just walking off the golf course. It can also lead to mistake or what I call an avoidance mindset, where they're trying to avoid future mistakes. And obviously they can be very self-critical of themselves, have some negative self-talk, and beat themselves up for the errors. Now, what I didn't include in the model of the frustrated athlete, which I'll obviously talk about in future videos, is something happens here between the triggers in the sport environment and the emotions. In other words, if, for example, you make an error, you miss a shot or miss the net, for example, with your shot, it doesn't automatically mean that the athlete is going to become frustrated with that or have some negative emotions. There's something that happens here in the middle in terms of how an athlete perceives that mistake or that error, and thus how it's going to affect their emotions, and finally how it's going to affect their performance. If you have any comments on this video, please leave your comments. Would love to hear your comments. Or if you have any specific challenges with yourself or with the athletes you work with or coach, please leave a comment for me so I can address that in future videos. Thanks. This is Dr. Cohn for KidsSportsPsychology.com.